Hello, welcome to From Caracas. In this opportunity, we have a special guest. We are speaking with Marianny Rosado. She's a lecturer. She is a former trade commerce vice minister here in Caracas, in Venezuela, and also she's an international analyst. We'll welcome her because today we're going to be talking about this recent news about the neoliberal package of measures implemented by Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, and how these social protests, these social movements have raised to call out for the end of this decree. Welcome, Marianny.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us here From Caracas. Marianny, is this kind of measures that governments sign with International Monetary Fund common, that people are aware of the consequences that they are going into?
Maybe people it's aware of them regarding what's been going on in between Latin America and our countries in the last 20 years. It happened to Venezuela. It have happened to every country in this hemisphere. So we kind of have this history of what's going on with the IMF measures, and we know already what's going on and what's going to happen after this.
We've seen also how the people reacted. Social movements, the indigenous movements, the Ecuadorian indigenous and social movements, they reacted against this 883 decree. They were calling out on the streets of 12 days, almost 12 days of massive protests in the streets. They were calling for the end of this decree. Why people, just simple people, the peoples of the countries of our Latin American countries, they reacted in this way when these measures are announced?
Because these are the most vulnerable population ever. We are talking about poverty. Mm-hmm. We're talking about life expectancy. We're talking about the poorest people in our countries. The indigenous are these people who suffered in the first place, suffered from what's going on in the Pachamama, what's going on with earth, with their water, with their food, with their possibilities to go to the market and sell their products. We're talking about life.
But when we talk also about life, we also talk about these ways in which governments, these neoliberal governments, talk when they forget where they come from. We heard President Lenin Moreno calling the indigenous movements thieves. We heard him calling the indigenous and social movements on the streets violent. He called them terrorists. And they were just on the streets claiming for their right. Why does governments can't accept that the people go on the streets and claim for their rights?
Well, for transnational capital, our people, they are the enemies to beat. Mm-hmm. So they got to be, labeled after violent or any kind of word, trying to put them as the people who's against some rational mm-hmm. kind of measures or politics, but these are the victims. These are the victims. So they are on the right to say no to such things.
We have in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a history of neoliberal governments that came to power that called their predecessors as dictatorships, as being rough on the people, about forgetting the people. But when actually those governments that preceded them actually went out and gave their hand to the people. They said, you need health, I give you health. You need education, I give you education. Come with me, I will help you. Why does neoliberal governments such as Lenin Moreno have shown in these days, that just blaming their predecessors is a way of maybe cleaning themselves a little bit and show to the world another face?
Well, this is part of the plan. In the first place, when you are on your marketing period, you kind of say the good things, what people wants to hear. To be elected, you have to talk in this kind of language. You have to be very popular, criticize the one who's before you, but the whole thing has got to do with a plan, a very and good structured plan to put people on a situation. These people who's vulnerable, they got the possibility to be free.
So, Marianny, how do the neoliberal reforms are affecting the Ecuadorian people in these last almost 12 days of protest that we've been seeing on the news?
Well, first days, it's going to be kind of that, a reaction, a social reaction regarding what people feel about this kind of measures. But in the future days and in future months and years, this process just started. So Ecuadorian people should be very aware of what's going to be decided next, because these processes, they never stop with only one protest. No matter how many dead people or disappeared or anything, this process started against people, and people has to fight against them.
What kind of consequences does these kind of measures, these kind of agreements signed with the International Monetary Fund bring to the countries? Do people really know, are they conscious what kind of debt they are assuming when they sign these agreements with International Monetary Fund?
Maybe not, but they should be watching on the mirror of Venezuela, for example. When an IMF inspector or when an IMF agent visits a country which is not asking for a credit, and they try to convince them to take that credit. Maybe the credit is 20% interest only, but in the short time it's going to be 35%. And when that happens, it started kind of a roller coaster, only going up regarding interest and several conditions. For example, cutting feeding programs, cutting education programs, cutting maybe house building programs, and that's the thing that people is going to suffer the most, because vulnerable people, they need those programs to survive.
As you were telling me when I was asking you before about how these social and indigenous movements reacted and were on the streets claiming for the derogation of this 883 decree.
When they are for real the victims of these measures. Neoliberalism, they don't care about people or the environment. They just care about the capital. And big people, big enterprises inside the market, they do what they have been doing for years in Africa or in Latin America. They've been kidnapping the future of people who thinks or who work for their freedom.
Marianny, but there is a curious case specifically in Latin America, because we've seen through the Latin American history that there have been a series of neoliberal governments implementing this kind of agreements with the International Monetary Fund. We saw Argentina that signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund. Then Cristina Fernandez and her husband Kirchner, they paid back that debt assumed with the International Monetary Fund. And now again, President Mauricio Macri signed a new agreement with the International Monetary Fund. And now we are seeing Ecuador also signing agreements with the International Monetary Fund. What kind of country do they want to live, or they want to give to those peoples, the ones that need the most?
A split one, because these measures, they are orientated to split countries all in several pieces. Those pieces are being controlled by them, by the IMF. And what I wanted to punctualize is that maybe it's not the thing with the credit, with the public credit. The thing is the control they have in the economy. They've been having trouble to control their economies. They've been more dependent. They've been a lot more less productive than ever, because of this position the United States assumes, which is the big actor beyond IMF, and the ones who are getting these advantages on the trading all around the hemisphere. For example, the United States right now is the very first one importer and exporter of food. And when they do that, they control the variables. They control the market. And when they do that, they put the prices and the conditions, and they say who's gonna eat what, who's gonna sell what, and how, and in what conditions. So it's kind of a control kind of mechanism over our economies. And before that, people got to move, got to organize themselves, because governments like Lenin Moreno or any other country or government in Latin America is going to be suffering from that, whether they don't get together and organize as countries against these kind of forces.
You were talking about these measures that governments take, and you were putting these examples also, but in Ecuador specifically, we've seen that people were claiming the right and security that having subsidiated oil has for them. But also we heard, and that's curious, that President Lenin Moreno was blaming other people for the crisis and for the repression and for the protests. He blamed Nicolás Maduro, he blamed Rafael Correa, he blamed those leaders, those peoples who represent progressive forces in the region, the ones who actually raised their voice for those that were protesting on the streets against those measures. Why blaming others when you are the responsible of the agreement you just signed and these measures that you are imposing in a way to the society?
Well, it has to do with instrumentalizing situation in Venezuela to say that we are, or Nicolás Maduro is the one who's doing something about crisis in Ecuador when they are aggressors against their own people. And we saw that just when Lenin Moreno won elections. We saw that days after they betrayed a project, a political project in Latin America, not only in Ecuador. They betrayed La Patria Grande project. So what are we going to talk about? What are we talking about? This is betraying a whole million people. You're betraying dreams, security of your nation. You're betraying a political project which is saying we are going to protect people, we are going to protect environment, we are going to grow up as an economy between us, we're going to support each other. That's not going to happen under these conditions. IMF put it, and they were agree to implement in Ecuador. That's a very bad move on this government, but it's not unexpected. By the time Lenin Moreno showed their real face, we could saw him for real, and that's the real face of transnational capital interests.
On your experience as a former deputy minister for trade and commerce in Venezuela, how, and also a lecturer at university, how do you explain, how do you trace a campaign or a path of how to go against the International Monetary Fund to do not let fall under its ruling? How do you explain how its debts also puts governments and countries under their control?
Well, first of all, we have to say that our countries are really rich. We have rich countries, very productive, and what we've been doing with all this crisis, we have to remember the go-go banking thing back in the 70s. We had a situation regarding new oil industry, you know, the boom of the oil industry. We had a lot of money, and what we did back in those years were putting our money in the Chase Manhattan Bank, in the JP Morgan, and what happened after that? They convinced us to get more public credits, and they started on low interest, and then they proceeded to higher interest, unpayable interest in time after time. So those interests were together with several conditions regarding social programs, and that's a recipe. That's the IMF recipe. It's got to do with a previous plan they thought, and they thought to put on our shoulders, to control us, to capture our richness and our production. So what should a government do? A government should protect our people. They should protect their people, especially the ones who are the producers, because this kind of activity, producing, maybe in the land, maybe construction, maybe services, but the productive sector has got to be protected, very protected by our governments, because when you allow a big bank to get into your little town and to take control of your local market, then after that you cannot expect anything regarding independence, economic independence, or liability to your local economic. So people should be organizing themselves to ask the government to be supportive and protective regarding their needs as producers, guarantees, credit, services, and social security, family planning, housing, and education. That's what our government should do for the people. And that's going to be possible under IMF conditions. Never in life.
This caring for the people, this taking into consideration their people's needs, is this what kind of the thought, of the dream, of the way of implementing this kind of attention by ALBA, by UNASUR, by creating a common market that benefits Latin America? Is that those are the alternative to that neoliberalism that tries to implement the international monetary fund?
Of course, that's an alternative in and in constructing and in building alternative, but it's got a big challenge because we have to defeat in our local and in the international organizations we already have, and in the local law system, we have to punctualize, to identify the international agreements international contracts regarding national interest. Maybe people doesn't know this, but we have a lot of intern enemies regarding what's been the neoliberal implementing of the United States diplomacy, the IMF diplomacy against us. It's in our laws. So we have to identify those instruments. We have to punctualize their effects, and we have to derogate them. It's not only the 883 decree. We have to check out inside of our system, because we have in there the seed of a very non-equal relationship between local capitals and foreign capitals. We should be protecting the local capitals because, first of all, because they are small. They need to be protected. And after that, we have to protect them because they are producing current products and current services, common services for everybody. So if you don't want to be devastated or occupied by an imperio, you should be protecting your people.
Is that also the reason why Lenin Moreno has been criminalizing UNASUR and ALBA in this process?
Of course, part of this balkanization kind of policy from the United States and the IMF against our countries, it's got to do with that. You know, putting apart countries, putting apart our relationships, our union inside Latin America and the Caribbean. We should be more together than ever, and we should be putting more, strengthen those organizations, international organizations we created when Comandante Chavez was alive. UNASUR, ALBA, they should be getting inside our law system to be, to get the traction they need to be available, to be in the condition of making, production and more trade between us, not that much to the United States or Europe, but between us. We have to do this South Bank we've never done already. We have to do a lot of things which are still dreams. That's a big challenge for us.
Thank you, Marianny.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking with us, for sharing your time with us. We've been talking today with Marianny Rosado. She's former Deputy Minister from Trade and Commerce here in Venezuela, in Caracas. And also she's a lecturer and international analyst. And we spoke with her about the neoliberal motivations behind agreements with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and how the governments in Latin America and how the people in Latin America are expected or are always heard when they are talking about claiming their rights against these kind of measures, to be the ones that are heard and the governments hear them. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us here from Caracas. Until next time.